The Night Stalker. Fun fact, my sister, who is 2 years younger than me, at 32, going on 33, she had no idea who the Night Stalker was. We were talking about all of the documentaries on Netflix we had been checking out. She had actually gotten COVID, and she's a single mom, and she works full-time, and she's finishing up her college degree. So I don't think that she usually has a lot of time to watch TV, but when she was sick, she had time, and she was catching up by watching some documentaries on Netflix. And I was like, I think at the time I was watching The Night Stalker, The Hunt for a Serial Killer Netflix documentary, and she confessed to me that she had never heard of Richard Ramirez. I can't believe that you would, anybody that was like born in the 80s or 90s never heard of The Night Stalker. Anyway, I have always pretty much been into true crime. Like anybody else, I'm fascinated by it. And I think Richard Ramirez was definitely, when was this? This was like, was it 1982? For some reason I feel like it was 1982. It was the 80s. The 80s, by this point, it's been a while. And so for people to still be making documentaries about this guy and to know who he is, he was, like, not to make anything sound positive about this person because he was sick and he was a monster, but he was fascinating. His backstory is absolutely heartbreaking when you learn what he came from. I think it was either in this documentary or somewhere else that, well, for one thing, when you take a psychology class, one of the very first things you start talking about is nature versus nurture. And people will say it's both, or some people probably really strongly believe it's one or the other. But I had seen somebody say that he was a psychopath that was made. Because his backstory, his childhood was so horrific. I don't know if I'm going to get into it in my notes, so I could just kind of touch on that since I have brought it up. I think that his dad was abusive. When he would punish him, he would like string him up in a I think there was a story, and it's probably in my notes, that he would string him up in a cemetery and make him stay out there like that overnight as a punishment. And then he had a brother or a cousin who, let's just go down the notes so I'm not just like spouting crazy stuff. Okay. His dad would tie him up to a cross in a cemetery overnight, and it was his cousin who killed his wife in front of Richard. And not only that, but he had gone to Vietnam and committed atrocities. And I feel like I always tie back to being a mom, but looking at my 1.5-year-old and thinking about how brand new she is to the world and how heartbreaking that it would be for something bad to happen to her and ruin the rest of her life. So if you think about, we were all babies once, even this guy, and for him to be in such a horrible environment that they almost made him, had he had a different family life, he may have grown up to be normal and had a good life, and it's just heartbreaking. But there were 4 episodes, I believe. Yes, there were 4 episodes. The first episode kind of shows what Los Angeles County was like at the time. It kind of shows the glitz, glam, beautiful side of Los Angeles, the side that everybody moves there for, and then the really dark underbelly of Los Angeles. Because when you think about serial killers, you think about California. California had a lot of them. I'm here in the Seattle area, and Seattle and just the state of Washington in general has had their fair share. Ted Bundy. Fun fact, Jesus, this is not a fun fact. I moved here from Pensacola, Florida, which downtown Pensacola is where they caught Ted Bundy. And then I live in the Seattle area, but Tacoma is 45 minutes away from Seattle. And that is where I believe Ted Bundy was born, but all around this area was where he started out with his victims. So I moved from one corner of the country to another. Both have significant histories with Ted Bundy case. So they talk about how the Pope and the Queen visited during this decade, and this was the decade that they hosted the Olympics in Los Angeles, and but then they say that it was a facade. This city attracted a lot of dangerous people. There's another interesting case about it was about a celebrity. I can't think of her name now, but I have it written down because I have an idea to do a video on her. I had heard an episode from the Last Ovation podcast before she just completely stopped making episodes on this person where before people made it harder or hid information, people's personal information to make it easier for them to find them, there were a couple cases where crazed fans hired private detectives or just found public information on celebrities and stalked them and killed them. That's kind of what this makes me think of, that there's this underbelly to Los Angeles. But I want to do a video on that. I could probably put the name of the person on the screen, but I have a lot of like true crime video ideas to do, and also just like celebrity, more so like older. So like I have no interest in today's celebrities, but like the celebrities of yesteryear kind of that I want to do. Kind of in the same vein of Last Ovation podcast, if you've heard it. Kind of like that, but you'll see. If you're interested, give this video a like and subscribe for future videos. So we hear from a woman who had this brief encounter with Richard Ramirez in a laundromat, and she talks about how he had dropped his hat, his black AC/DC hat, and she had picked it up, and when he got it back from her, she noticed that he was missing a lot of teeth. This same hat was found in a crime scene where a woman was shot dead in her kitchen. Her roommate, who had come in during all this, had been shot, but her keys deflected the bullet, and she was in the garage and tried to circle back around to the front door thinking he wouldn't come out the front door, but he did and was going to shoot her again, and she asked him not to because he'd already shot her, and he didn't, and he just walked away. And then from here he pulls a woman out of her car and shoots her. She survives, and a sketch artist goes to see her in the hospital, and his sketch matches another sketch that somebody had done of him previously. So they talk about how with each victim that he started ramping up his crime. One of the things that he did was he liked to see the fear in people's faces, so he would wait until he saw that fear before he would shoot them. They talk about the different crime scenes kind of in chronological order and talk about how he would get in, what he would do, what his MO was. The thing about his MO was it was kind of all over the place. He had crimes against children. He would typically go after the man first and shoot them and get them out of the way. But then he would, and this is a YouTube video, so I don't know like how much I can really say. I don't want to get demonetized or get my video taken down or anything, but he would assault the women, and sometimes he would kill them and sometimes he wouldn't. So in this documentary, you do hear from a lot of the victims, and there's more victims who survived than I even knew. This one particular crime scene, they say that he got into the house by standing on a 5-gallon bucket and crawling through a bathroom window. He would... Do we need all the gruesome details? I mean, this one case, after he assaulted the woman, he cut her eyes out. And then we hear from a woman now, who was a 6-year-old girl then. This is horrifying. So he opened the window in her room and took her from her bed at 6 years old. And she was half asleep and 6. And she didn't know what was going on, but she said that there was some kind of familiarity about him. And so she almost thought it was a family member that had taken her from bed. So she wasn't scared at first. But he put her in a duffel bag and smuggled her inside his house. She said that she kept hearing Madonna songs on a loop as he was assaulting her. And then he put her back in the duffel bag, took her to a gas station, and told her to call 911 and have her family pick her up. Very, very weird. There were a rash of similar attacks on children to where they were abducted and then later abandoned. When you hear from the cops being interviewed, they talk about how they'd never had a case where the victims and all the details surrounding these crimes were so varied. They had not had something like that. Apparently, in the study of this type of crime or in the study of criminals, they typically have a pattern, a particular behavior, a particular weapon. He used different kind of weapons. Men, women, and children were all victims. There were some consistencies, but it was kind of all over the place to the point where for a little while they didn't think that the crimes were connected until one cop, who was a younger cop, kind of had something to prove and didn't have a lot of people at first really wanting to listen to him because of his inexperience, kind of tied together. One thing that was one piece of information that was interesting was at one of the crime scenes he'd used thumb cuffs. Who knew thumb cuffs were a thing? Literally, is this thumb cuffs? So there was a crime scene where he used those on a woman and she was able to survive because her husband had called 911. And they found shoe prints at one of the murder scenes and child abduction scenes that seemed to match. So that episode ends with crime scene photos flashing around. Those are always really hard to see. I feel like they don't show a lot, but they show enough. And then we're on to episode 2. So there was kind of a duo of cops, one of which who had worked the Hillside Strangler case, which I'm not as familiar with, but apparently that had happened in the 70s. And so he was working with this rookie cop on it who kind of started connecting everything. So they got this seasoned veteran and then this new cop who had made the initial connections to this Night Stalker case. And it's kind of interesting that one cop would work on 2 notorious cases. But I guess, it is shocking and it isn't. Because back then, you didn't have DNA. People could go on for a lot longer before they're ever caught. So if they're, I guess, I don't know what the odds would be or like what the statistic would be, but maybe it's not as unfathomable that one cop would cover two such notorious cases, but it's kind of weird. He had quite a career apparently. So the next crime scene that they talk about is this married couple. The man was a deputy sheriff. The woman had seen a window open in her house that had always been shut. So the fact that it was open was alarming. And she gets her husband and he grabs his gun, goes around the house. She had heard someone coming in the window actually. And then outside that window they found an Avia shoe type that had matched the others that they had found. So it was a very uncommon shoe, only for the fact that not too many had been bought yet because it was a brand new shoe. And showing some really good detective work. I found this impressive. The cop went to talk to the inventor of the Avia shoe in Portland, Oregon, got their spreadsheets, started narrowing it down, was able to narrow it down to one shoe that shipped to LA but couldn't find the person who bought them. They were able to narrow it down that far. Ramirez had snacks at the crime scenes and drew pentagrams on the walls. So there was a crime scene technician who had worked on the evidence of these cases, and she was at home hanging out with her friends in her hot tub, and she heard someone screaming across the street. It turns out it was her neighbor who was tied to the bed who had been assaulted by what they believed to be the Night Stalker. Which, how chilling is that? For your job, you're working on this case, and then it hits close to home where a neighbor across the street, this could have been you. It's so crazy to think about. I just can't imagine how horrifying that is. Being that close to where something like that happened. So they go on to talk about another victim who was a grandmother. She was a single mom who had bought her house. She bought her own house. She was so proud of it. She called it her treasure. And her now elderly son, who they're interviewing at present time, recounts how he found her. And really, really sad story. But the car that had been stolen in the previous episode that they had mentioned, it had been impounded, but it hadn't been, I guess, properly searched. And so when they go back, a lot of the evidence wasn't any good anymore, but they did find a dentist business card and found out that he, for his bad teeth, had been going to this dentist. So in the next episode, which opens up with a montage of all his victims, they talk about how they put an alarm in the dental office so that when he comes back, the dentist can sound this alarm and the police will come and get him. Well, it turns out that it malfunctioned, and the dentist called and was like, "Where were you guys? This guy was back today. We sounded the alarm." And it was another setback and more people who would become victims because he wasn't caught on this day. Cut to another story about a woman talking about her grandparents and how she told them to lock their doors, but they were from the Midwest, and in the Midwest, you didn't lock your doors. So they said they didn't want to live like that. They wanted to be murdered. Very horrific scene, really, really violent. Basically, these people were unrecognizable, almost completely lost their head, one of them. The next one, they're all really sad and heartbreaking in their own way, but this one was really messed up, this next one. He had done 2 crimes in one night, and he went to a house where he killed the man, assaulted the woman, and her 8-year-old son. Can you imagine that nightmare? From anyone's perspective, but particularly the mother who could not protect her son. like, and they survived it. Next crime scene, he shoots a couple people in the head, but they both survived. And even the man chased Ramirez out of the house. And the person being interviewed about that crime scene talks about like how Ramirez ran from this guy because he was horrified that he had shot this guy and he was still coming after him. So he ran away. Around this time, so many people started buying guns, admitting not knowing how to use them, but they were terrified to be without one. People started taking self-defense classes. Some of the early names for the Night Stalker before the Night Stalker stuck were the Walk-In Killer and the Valley Intruder. The wife of the rookie cop, who was the rookie cop at the time, the next victim was close to their home, and she was like, that's it, I'm getting out of here. So she left. She and her kids could be safe while her husband was working to solve these murders. Another piece of evidence in addition to the Avia shoes were bullets that were particular in that they had a red primer. And around this time, the crimes moved to San Francisco. I think they moved to San Francisco because Ramirez was visiting a friend or family member or something out there, and he was continuing his crimes. One of his victims was a man whose name was Peter Pan. He was 66. His actual name was Peter Pan. No disrespect, this guy lost his life. I'm just saying his name's Peter Pan. So there were a lot of tension between the media and the police. The media were always trying to stick their nose in and get information and trying to hold that over the police's heads for some kind of piece in the action, whether it was like some kind of exclusive story. And there were points in the case where information was leaked to the media that would ultimately hurt the investigation, put them further behind, give more advantage to the Night Stalker, and have more people lose their lives that maybe could have been saved if some of this information hadn't been leaked. So in San Francisco, they found writing on a wall that was Manson-like. They called it Manson-like. The mayor of San Francisco held a press conference and divulged all the information of what they found to the public, and the police from LA County were livid about this because they think that it really hurt their case and that their investigation had been severely hindered. And then LA County Sheriff held a separate press conference letting everyone know that the action had severely hindered the case. They got a break in the case when a woman contacted the police about her father, who hung around a guy at a Greyhound bus station who had given him a gun. And that gun was given to someone in Tijuana, and then they tracked it to a stolen necklace that was given to a woman by a man named Armando, who was friends with the Night Stalker, aka Rick. So the police ask him for help in finding this guy, and at first he refuses because he's not going to be a snitch. But then you talk to the police officer who claims that he basically beat it out of this guy. And I don't know if this is him kind of embellishing a little bit. Maybe he's retired now and he can say these things and it doesn't affect his career. But I mean, not that I don't believe it, but also, people do talk themselves up. So this last episode 4, is where we get what I was just talking about at the beginning about Richard Ramirez's backstory. And so obviously you've got the family backstory. Ramirez abused drugs. And there's this librarian that talks about meeting Ramirez when he came in and asked about where the books on horoscopes and torture were kept. And he and other people in this documentary talk about Ramirez's horrible body odor and how that was very distinctive in their encounters with him. He had bad teeth, a gaunt face. There's a note here that says that his aforementioned body odor was likened to a goat. I don't know what a goat smells like, but apparently he smelled like one. So I think there was another car that he stole, or if it was the same car, they were able to get a partial fingerprint off the rearview mirror. And then in San Francisco, the police did another press conference where they released Richard's name to the public before he was even caught, which is, I don't know. I guess it could be a good or a bad thing. So if you do that, then if the police aren't able to find him, maybe like they'll get assistance from the public. But if he knows that he's been found, then he would run. So they started monitoring bus stations because they thought that he would flee. But it turns out that Ramirez was in Arizona meeting with, I don't know if it was friend or family, but he was in Arizona. And he was coming back in and hadn't heard any of this. But as he was coming back in, he was coming in the area where they were not monitoring. They were monitoring the outgoing area. And he saw a police presence. He saw people that were undercover that he knew couldn't have been homeless because they weren't actually dirty. They were trying to portray themselves as homeless. But he knew that they were undercover because they weren't dirty or smelly. So he goes running, but as he's getting on buses and trying to flee, people start to recognize him. More and more and more people, to the point where people start chasing him and he gets attacked by an angry mob. And he basically runs and runs until he gets tired of running, and then this mob takes him down basically. So it's kind of an interesting thought if you think about that scene. You know, he's running, he's trying to steal cars, he's trying to get away, but it's broad daylight and people know who he is, and there's strength in numbers, and people are not letting him get away. And it's such a juxtaposition to the Night Stalker. You know, you don't know who he is. He strikes at night. It could be your house. But now, broad daylight, he's been exposed. And people are kind of taking the power back. And he's rendered powerless. So it's very interesting to look at it both ways of how it ended up. Throughout this documentary, we hear a narration from what we think might be Ramirez's voice, and it turns out that it was, because he had done some prison interview. So you're hearing his words throughout the documentary. When he got arrested, they told him that they would put him in the same cell as the Hillside Strangler, and his defense attorney actually knew Ramirez's family. Ramirez's father, I think, called him to ask if he would defend him. So this lawyer was criticized for not having murder trial experience. And one thing that was really weird was Ramirez had a lot of groupies. And you'll hear about this sometimes with people who, I don't know why he was perceived to be a good-looking guy, because you just hear about his missing teeth and his body odor, his gaunt appearance, and yet he became some sort of a rock star in the courtroom for whatever reason and attracted fans. Very bizarre. So there was a guy in the documentary that talked about Ramirez's sex appeal and animal magnetism to women. And then a woman came on who was interviewed and called them stupid bitches. I wrote balls with a Z. So they wound up dismissing all the child assault cases just because they didn't want to re-victimize the kids and make them have to testify. They had plenty of evidence in the actual murder cases. So he faced 13 other murder charges, 140 witnesses in trial, found guilty on 43 counts. They think that there were a lot more murders that were attributed to him. He, in 2013, died after 2 decades on death row, and he wound up dying from cancer. The 6-year-old girl who was one of his victims that survived talked about how even though bad things had happened to her, she turned out fine and now has a family of her own. So that is it for the Netflix special Night Stalker Hunt for a Serial Killer. I'm sure you've probably already seen other videos on this, and I'm the literal last person to post. So if you liked it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos. Turn on notifications to be notified of future videos. And let me know if you remember this guy or if this is your first time hearing about him from this documentary. Do you listen to true crime podcasts? If so, what's your favorite? I'm always looking for more because I have been binging Sword and Scale as of late, which is a pretty heavy podcast, but pretty well done. It was one of the originals, one of the OG true crime podcasts. And I've been binging True Crime Obsessed, which is true crime, but with a funny spin on it. These people are very, very funny. Actually, I think that they're going to be doing this documentary as one of their episodes, but I think it's going to be on their Patreon, which I'm not subscribed to, so I probably won't wind up hearing it. I don't know. Some of these podcasts I will wind up maybe subscribing to for a bit just to get some of the additional episodes because I run through them so quickly. So anyways, if you have some true crime podcast suggestions, let me know. And I'll see you in the next video.